Hello everybody and welcome to this video, the first in a brand new series on Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Everything you see in this video series comes from the ebook Mr. Bruff's Guide to Great Expectations, available for £3.99 at mrbruff.com, and it contains 50,000 words of analysis. It is everything you need to know. And what I'm going to talk about today are some of the themes, or one of the themes in the novel. So it's important to note that Charles Dickens was, above all, a storyteller. So while he undoubtedly cared passionately about social justice and worked a lot of the wrongs in his society into the plots and characters of his work, he does not give the impression of having sat down and said to himself, I'm going to write a book about love, or I'm going to write a book about loss or greed or whatever. It seems more that he had an idea for a story. A young orphan boy is lifted out of poverty by a benefactor and made a gentleman, for instance, then works out circumstances of how and why it might have happened, and then he fleshes out the characters and looks at the consequences for those characters. Now, although he would have known roughly where he was going with his story, his books were originally published in installments in magazines, and he would have undoubtedly have been influenced by the feedback he got along the way, building on characters that gripped the public imagination, occasionally introducing characters who hadn't been in the original plan to overcome a plot problem and that kind of thing. Having said which, of Dickens's 15 novels, 11 take their title from a named individual or place, and 2 titles, A Tale of Two Cities and Our Mutual Friend, reference an individual or places in the story. It's only Hard Times and Great Expectations which seem to refer specifically to a theme, so we should perhaps start with the theme of Great Expectations. And that's quite interesting because obviously whenever you choose a title for a text, it's completely up to you. And the idea that this was pretty rare for Dickens to choose a title which actually wasn't about a character or place makes us think carefully about the theme itself of Great Expectations. We know that Dickens wrote the book as if it was the autobiography of Pip, so as far as Pip is concerned, his Great Expectations were the core theme of his life up to the age of writing in his mid-30s. Indeed, the book starts when he's 7 years old and contains next to nothing about his life prior to that, and it does that because this is when he first meets Magwitch, the man responsible for his change in fortune. So, it's not a simple fairy tale about an orphan child who does a good deed to a poor man and is rewarded enormously when that man becomes rich and lives happily ever after. It's much more complicated than that. But to explore this as a theme, we need to be clear that the title and the central chunk about the story are about the expectations of wealth, not wealth itself. Let me say that again. The central chunk of the story is about the expectations of wealth, not wealth itself. It's frustrating not to know more about Pip's parents. He's clearly a very intelligent child and he's well able to benefit from a gentleman's education. But this is not to say that the effects of his change of circumstances are entirely benign. While he is in the process of transformation, he is very unfair to and unappreciative of Joe and Biddy, and this might have been psychologically necessary, but it's not admirable. He's not just a sort of one-dimensional heroic character. The real significance of Pip's expectations, however, is that they weren't just about money, and the condition of coming into his fortune that he must not make an attempt to discover who his benefactor is, leads to a confusion which allows him to believe that Estella, who he'd been infatuated by almost since he met her, is intended for him. So there are 2 threads going on here. In one, he helps a convict on the marsh who wants to give Pip what he could never have for himself. He wants to make him a gentleman. And in the other, quite independently, a rich, jilted spinster uses him in grooming her adopted daughter Estella to take revenge on men. And in the process, Pip gets a taste for the life of a gentleman and a desire to become one in order to have a chance of winning Estella. Now, when these 2 threads come together, they get hopelessly entangled in Pip's mind, so that his expectations are not just of wealth, but of Estella too. What he expects is to be rich and to have Estella as his wife. Now, when Pip believes that his life is mapped out for him, that he's going to receive a large portion of Miss Havisham's fortune, with Estella thrown in as a kind of bonus prize for good measure. He loses control of his own life and direction. He overspends even his generous allowance and finds no purpose. His better nature starts to fight back when he begins funding Herbert's business partnership, but it's only when he discovers the true source of his expectations and is appalled by it and the implications of it that he starts to make good decisions. Although Wemmick and Jaggers are horrified by the ultimate forfeiture of Magwitch's wealth to the British state, Pip had decided long before then that he didn't want the money. He even wishes he could pay back what has already been spent on him. And what he finds hardest to come to terms with is the realization that if the money didn't come from Miss Havisham, then of course Estella is not intended for him. It's a kind of double whammy of disappointment. So there's a subtle play on words going on between the more old-fashioned definition of expectations. You can see on the screen the definitions and what we might think of, but look at 1.2 down here. The archaic definitions of the word expectations are to do with one's prospects of inheritance. And that's the definition that we really need to hold on to in our understanding not just of the importance of the title, but of course our understanding of one of the main themes of the text. So this subtle play on words actually suggests that the meaning of expectations is the prospects of inheritance, and the now more common meaning of a belief that something will happen. The two are kind of at odds with each other. You see, Pip is given expectations in the older sense and builds his own in the newer sense on them at the cost of a lot of heartache and distress. But neither expectation is ever realised. Of course, Dickens does imply in the revised ending, which became the published one, that Pip might finally get together with Estella after the end of the story is written. But they are vapour, and as long as he looks to his expectations rather than his own resources to give his life purpose, he flounders. When he says no to the money, when he accepts that Estella is lost to him, then he can start putting things right. He can make Miss Havisham value her cousin Matthew and his son Herbert. He can appreciate Joe and Biddy for what they are, and he can set about earning his own living in a respected business. None of this would have been possible without meeting Miss Havisham and Estella, or Magwitch's and Miss Havisham's money, but they were never ends in themselves. Miss Havisham built her life on a dream and threw it away when the dream didn't work out. Magwitch dreamed a dream of making a poor young orphan a gentleman, and this dream gave him the motivation to turn his life around. But he too had no plan B when things didn't turn out like he'd expected. In fact, he refused to recognise it. Miss Havisham's various relatives, Sarah Pocket, Camilla, Georgiana, waste much time and effort on the expectation of a share of Miss Havisham's fortune. Even Matthew Pocket expected life to fall into his lap, as to some extent does his son Herbert. Orlick expected to be apprenticed by Joe, and becomes really bitter when he's not. Expectations, then, are a key theme, and expectations are all very well, but they should never be relied on. That perhaps is the main theme of the story, that we can have these expectations, but we must not rely on them. There are, of course, other themes that are woven through the text and are important in realising the objectives of the story. So some of the other themes that we'll look at in future videos and that we cover in the ebook are control, growing up, society, love, crime, and time. I hope you found this video useful, guys. Please do subscribe to the channel.